Thank you for joining us at XM.com for this Forex Preview video. I'm Cristina Marujos. Joining me today is Senior Investment Analyst Rafi Boyajian. We'll be looking at Australian CPI. Now, it's going to be a very important week for Australia regarding data. We have a lot of important releases this week, including retail sales out on Friday. But let's focus a little bit on the most important one out on Wednesday, which is, of course, quarterly inflation. Now, Australian CPI is expected to have risen slightly in quarter two. What does that tell us about the economy?
Well, it basically tells us that Australia is joining other nations in entering a low growth, low inflation environment. You said inflation is expected to tick slightly higher in the second quarter. We're expecting a figure of 1.5%. That's only slightly higher from the 1.3% we saw in the first quarter, and that was the lowest in 2.5 years. So overall inflation is well below the RBA's target band of 2 to 3%. Underlying inflation is also below target. The RBA had been relying on a tightening labor market to lift inflation through higher wage growth, but we're seeing a bit of a slowdown in the labor market in Australia as a result of the slowing growth picture, both not just in Australia but globally as well, particularly in China, which is Australia's biggest trading partner. So all of that is going to make it very difficult for the RBA to hit its inflation goal in the next two quarters.
Now, speaking of the RBA, it's holding its policy meeting next week. Markets are not expecting it to cut rates at this policy meeting. It already gave 2 rate cuts in June and July. But do you think the data released this week could be a game changer?
It's unlikely to be a game changer, although we're not expecting data to be particularly impressive. So the data will probably reinforce the view that further rate cuts will be needed by the RBA later in the year. But for the time being, the RBA will probably want to wait and see what the effects of the 2 cuts that it carried out over the past 2 months, to what extent they're going to boost growth. And of course, we did have that tax cuts announced by the government recently, and that could also potentially support growth in Australia as well. So the RBA would probably want to wait and see how things pan out over the coming months, and not just domestically as well, but also what happens to the US-China trade war as well, and how that would affect the Australian growth.
And finally, what about the Aussie? What is the outlook for the Australian dollar?
Well, the Aussie has been on a bit of a roller coaster ride in recent weeks. We saw the Aussie initially rising against the US dollar when we saw those expectations surging that the Fed will move aggressively to cut interest rates. Then we saw those expectations being pared back somewhat, and the Aussie has now come under pressure. It's now struggling at 1 month's lows. So what happens to the Australian dollar will really depend on what the Fed signals at its meeting tomorrow, whether they're going to signal many big rate cuts or just a few insurance cuts, which if that's the case, then the Aussie could fall further.
I see. Rafi, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching us at XM.com.